Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
James Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak on the budget policy debate, and particularly a great pleasure to follow Simon Bridges, who has talked a great deal about growth and about their enormous investment and growing investment in transport. For example, the blowout on the costs from the Warkworth to Wellsford motorway, estimated to cost between 1.4 and 1.9 billion, with a... Oh, he's left. How about that? I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker. I withdraw. With a cost-benefit ratio of 0.25, and that cost-benefit ratio was estimated when the cost was due to be $494 million, as opposed to, oh, look at that, $2 billion. So, yes, growth and increasing investment in things that were supposed to cost roughly a quarter of what they're going to cost at a time when even then they had a pretty weak business cost ratio. So the kind of growth that this government has been talking about in this debate, they've gone on a lot about growth, so I'll just sort of say a few things about the kind of growth we're experiencing. We're having growing polluted rivers, growing numbers of endangered species, growing numbers of people living in cars and garages, growing numbers of young families who cannot buy their way into their first home, a growing cost of living for the elderly who are increasingly hit by accommodation costs, growing costs of living for the bottom 30% of income earners whose cost of living is growing extensively, far faster than their wages are growing, Mr. Speaker. Growing greenhouse gas emissions. Since this government came to office, we've had 19% growth in greenhouse gas emissions. We've had growing numbers of communities that are on water restrictions and boil notices at the same time as we've had growing exploitation of underground aquifers by large-scale irrigation projects and water bottling plants who take that water out of the ground for free without, while those same communities are on those boil restrictions. We've had growing congestion in Auckland. The average Aucklander now spends 12 business days a year stuck in traffic, and that congestion is only getting worse. And that is at the same time that Mr. Bridges has been growing the so-called investment, funneling good money after bad into roading projects that don't solve the problem and in fact expand the problem. We've had growing oil and gas exploration at the same time as we're pretending to put in place some kind of climate plan. We have had growing unemployment. There was growing unemployment in the last quarter. Cadbury, of course, is the latest manufacturing plant in New Zealand to hit the wall. So, Mr. Speaker, this is the kind of growth that we are seeing in this country, and it is the kind of growth that if it was growing on your body, your doctor would send you off to see a specialist. When I hear members on the government side talking about GDP as this holy grail, you've got to remember all GDP is an estimate of economic activity. It's just activity. It doesn't say what kind of activity. It doesn't say whether that activity is any good, whether it's any useful or anything like that. You have an earthquake and you have GDP growth. Right? So let's have more earthquakes because that grows GDP. If GDP is the be-all and the end-all, then going to war tends to increase GDP. So let's go to war because that's great for GDP growth and we should be all for it. We've got the kind of growth, Mr. Speaker, but we don't have prosperity. What good is growth without prosperity? That is my challenge to the government. When I think I heard Amy Adams saying that our growth was growing faster than other countries, when you consider the kind of growth that we're having, it's kind of like boasting that my melanoma is growing faster than yours. And, Mr. Speaker, that to me is an entirely unhealthy way of looking at the economy or the kind of useful activity that we could be seeing here. Now, I'd like to respond. It is ridiculous, isn't it, that you've got this kind of growth in this country? It is ridiculous that we're having such appalling results for our environment and for our people, even while all this so-called activity is going on. Now, I do want to respond to one of the points that the new chair of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, Chris Bishop, raised before. He was talking about what a bad idea it is to borrow to invest. It's somehow a bad idea to borrow to invest. Well, I'll tell you what. I have worked in a number of businesses that grew because they borrowed to invest. That's actually what you do. Actually, for anybody who can afford a house, what do? You borrow money, it's called a mortgage, and you invest it in a house. And that has actually been a runaway activity in this economy over the course of the last few years, Mr Bishop. People borrow to invest all the time. And Mr Bishop was saying, let's not borrow from the credit card. Well, credit cards running at 15 to 20% interest, Mr Speaker, but in this country you can get long-term bonds at 2% for 30 years. That is not credit card rates of interest. So if you want to borrow to invest, now is as good a time as any in recent history for a government to borrow to invest in the things that it needs, whether it needs transport and infrastructure. We've got a huge deficit in our water infrastructure that needs looking after, Mr Speaker. It is a good time to borrow to invest in the things that all of our people can use to grow their businesses, to support their families, and so on. Now, he also said that the Cullen Fund was set up as a place to invest the surpluses that the Labor government consistently ran in every single budget that they ran. And he's absolutely right. In every single budget, they ran a surplus and then they invested those surpluses in the Cullen Fund. And he says, well, we're not going to do that because, well, you know, we're not going to borrow to put money into the Cullen Fund because we're not running surpluses yet. Well, here's the thing. If you keep cutting taxes, you stop running surpluses. And this is the thing that staggers me, is that they keep saying, oh, look, we're not going to save for the future. We're not going to, we can't run these surpluses. Oh, but by the way, tax cuts, everybody. And that, to me, if you want ridiculous, that is ridiculous. If you cut your revenue lower than your expenses, then obviously you're not going to run surpluses. And if you don't run the surpluses, you've got nothing to spend on the Cullen Fund. So that's why you're in trouble on the superannuation, Mr Bishop. So it comes down, Mr Speaker, to what are your priorities? What are the priorities in government here? And we have seen this government cut core public services, some to the bone. In health, Annette King has done a superb job of unveiling the real terms cuts to the health budget over the course of this government. In education, how many schools still have the same swimming pools that they had when any people in this chamber learned how to swim? How many of those schools are still completely free to attend? And I venture very, very few indeed. And here's a question. How many of those schools still have kids from all walks of life? Have we stratified to that point now as a result of this government has cut, in real terms, funding to state schools while expanding it to private schools? So they're able to say that the quantum of money that is going to schools has increased. In the Department of Conservation, $424 million real terms lower spend now than it was in the last year of the Labor government. In real terms, $53 million a year worse off in the conservation budget than it was in the last year of the Labor government. And we do say it over and over again because it's true. In addition, a huge imbalance in the economy. Well, forgive me for doing the job of Her Majesty's loyal opposition. So, in addition, the ongoing imbalance in the economy, Mr Speaker. The ongoing imbalance in the economy, Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Which is that in this country, because the government continues to refuse to deal with the enormous imbalance of the tax advantage that property has over other asset classes, not only does that mean that the government misses out on a source of revenue, but it also means that we have runaway house price inflation, huge accommodation costs, which contribute to massive blowouts in the cost of living, especially for the elderly and for people on low incomes, Mr Speaker. So they've got their priorities all wrong. They've restricted their own revenue, at the same time pretending that that somehow means that they can't invest in the future of government superannuation. Mr Speaker, it was St Augustine who said, "God make me chaste, but not yet." This government makes announcement after announcement to make it look like they're doing something without actually solving the problem. And in superannuation, electric vehicles, clean rivers, predator-free, all of these are huge announcements but devoid of results. Mr. Speaker, when the Green Party gets into government, we will be measured not on announcements and activity but on results. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good work. Good speech.
Speaker.
I call Fletcher Tabato.